We're going to be looking at what's the right way to use analytics and data, build and manage a good API product.
Thanks for joining us today for another webinar. My name is Brian Pagano, and I'm coming to you from San Jose, California. And I'm joined by my colleagues Kumar and Teresa. Teresa?
Hi.
Kumar?
Hello.
All right, it's going to be hard to shut these guys up today. Hey, remind you guys that we have a group called API Craft. It's kind of a great place to ask questions and to continue the conversation. Anything that we can't address during the live webinar, that's a great place to go and ask your questions. And we also have a video channel for those who like to consume their media that way, youtube.com/Apogee. We've got this video will be posted there, as well as all the previous videos we've done. A lot of good stuff there. We also always post the decks to SlideShare. Let's get into, because this is a pretty interesting topic we're going to talk about today. We've talked about data and analytics in the past, often as a tangential topic to what we're talking about. Today it's the main course, and I love the fact that we're talking about design being analytics driven. So maybe, Teresa, you could give us some context as to why we're here today talking about this.
Yeah, so last time I was invited to one of your webinars, I talked about Accenture's 2013 technology vision, where we saw the trends of APIs as pervasive in enabling the digital business, where every business is now a digital business. So today, one of those trends is around designing for analytics. And the key principle of that trend is to have the analytics to provide the insights to be able to answer those critical business questions. And this doesn't happen by accident, it happens by design. So Accenture research found that half the time companies lack the right data to answer those questions. And so the whole purpose of this is to start with the questions and then design to get the right answers by finding the data and the analytics to feed into those answers. And so I thought this would be a great trend and principle to apply to the space of an API program.
Okay. And Kumar, anything you want to add to what we're
I think
talking
that's
about today?
exactly right. You have to know what questions you need to ask, and getting the questions right is absolutely critical to making the right decisions, the right choices as you go. And it doesn't matter if you're starting with the API journey or you're in the middle or you're in the last stage or wherever you are. It's about always knowing the right questions, asking them, and then going about answering them. And it's always critical to actually plan for these questions to change over time and kind of design for it up front so that you can adjust. And even if you're not collecting the right data, because you have designed for it, you can start collecting it, start analyzing it, and answer the right questions at the right time.
Great. And I think for those people like myself are wondering, so why is this such a hot topic today? What's the urgency right now? Because most companies will have some sort of analytics and business intelligence and data collection going on throughout their company. But it seems like the context is changing quite a bit, right? We've got mobile devices, we've got different kinds of things and partners and people generating data, and we've got a lot of unnecessary data being generated. Big data is not necessarily a solution; it can be a problem also. So I'm very curious as we dig through this today to find out the urgency for folks of why is this important today? Because I'm sure a lot of folks are thinking, I've kind of got this covered.
Yes, and so I think, as part of what we're talking about is that API analytics is really focused on improving the API as a product. So, as this audience already knows, API, the product influences the design, the functionality, the terms, the SLAs. It's all driving towards a business goal, right? So like any other product, you need to understand, when am I successful? Who are my consumers? How's it faring in relation to my business goals? And so to answer these questions, we're really focusing API analytics on that API product, right? So you mentioned things like big data. Well, sometimes big data, it's just about data. Here, we might use big data to ultimately get our insights, but the point is to start with those questions around, is my API program successful? And so a lot of what we're moving towards is, a lot of folks as well who have API programs think that I have trends, I have reports, thus I have API analytics. And we want to move against that. So that's important. It tells you what happened, but we want to move towards what is happening and why. So a quick example here is, if you have early detection of low API volumes, along with visibility into whether the problem stems from IT issues or from confusion due to poor documentation, then that allows for more speedy and effective resolution before it becomes widespread. So you needed that, what is happening and why to be able to do that, as opposed to just the what is happening.
And it actually, if you think about it, it comes down to choice, right? Your consumers, your end users, developers, partners, everyone has a choice. They can choose to use your products, your services, your APIs, your apps, or they might not. And they are being bombarded with all sorts of apps, all sorts of choices, technology choices, product choices, and it's about understanding what they're doing with your products and looking at the analytics and actually ensuring that if there are problems, just like Teresa said, they are addressed early on. You actually know that the problem exists. You can address it. You can understand that once you put in a fix, it actually fixed the problem. And all of these are critical to ensure that this short attention time span that consumers might have, because all the choices they have, does not hurt you in the long run.
That's an excellent point. We are definitely living in an era of choice, and it's not just the third parties. It's also your partners may choose to do more or less business with you, depending on how much you've got this covered. And even your own internal teams may choose to do more or less innovative things, or use the correct way of doing something versus a less standard, less approved way of doing things, the way you don't want them to do things. There are choices to be made all around.
Right.
Let's go, because this dovetails beautifully into what, so we talked about some of the things that we want people to do, and we're about to go into the questions you should be asking at the design up front. But there's a lot of people who associate, every time we say data and analytics, they immediately start thinking of these other words. And I'm guessing because you put them on the slide that they should not be thinking of these things.
Right, and we're saying that these other types of analytics, business activity monitoring, Google Analytics, Flurry, data warehousing, big data, we talked about that. They're all important and they all have their right role. They're just not tuned towards answering the question around, is my API successful? So we're not saying one replaces the other. They all have their own right. But for today, we want to focus on the importance of the API product.
Yeah, and you can kind of put it in the same idea in that the fact that APIs it's a different channel, right? And there are products that are really well designed to handle the requirements for particular channels. And because API it's a different channel, and the way it works is different, the way you interact with your developers, your users is different. It requires you to ask and design in a different way. And all of these products can work together. It's data, it's getting the end-to-end perspective requires you to combine everything together. But I think the point we want to make is that it's a different channel, and so you want to think about it a little differently, and then figure out how you combine the data to actually answer the bigger questions at hand.
I do want to mention that in all these other types of analytics, using the rich metadata and the vantage point provided by the API layer will probably help in some of these other types of analytics, like the business activity monitoring, to be able to tie in the vantage point as to the apps, and then when partners are calling your APIs, will definitely enrich that, but that's not our focus for today.
Okay, so is it fair to say that the API data is additive? The analytics you're going to do off of your API information is probably a gap that you have. You have a lot of other things, and this is probably a gap, so it's going to be additive and not a replacement.
That's
I
right.
Understood. So, and I'll be interested as we go through the conversation to talk about one thing I've noticed is companies who do get a lot of the instrumentation correct. So they have thought about the questions, they get things, and they don't have a way to act on that information. That doesn't seem very useful to me. And likewise, companies that have gateways and platforms and the ability to take action, but they're flying blind. They don't know what action to take. You really need both, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's a virtuous cycle, right? So you need to have the insights to figure out what to do, and then the capability to actually act on it. So I think everything that we're moving towards is to be actionable around what is happening and why, and to ultimately do something about it.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure it wasn't an academic exercise, that once they got this, they'll have a nice report that no one can look at.
In fact, that is the most overlooked aspect of analytics, is the last part where you consume the analytics to actually take an action, make a decision. So I like to think about this in terms of human latency, right? So what's the latency for gathering the data, processing it, sharing it with your other colleagues, actually arriving at a decision and then taking an action, and then actually seeing what the feedback is based on that action and actually understanding whether you took the right actions. And that last mile is always overlooked, and it's critical to actually making analytics really part of your business strategy.
Excellent. And did you use the term human latency?
I use the
That is a new one for me. That's fantastic. So it starts with the insights. Now, tell me about that. Tell me why it starts with the insights.
Right, so what we wanted to do was to start with the required insights needed to answer your business questions. And so one of the ways to get those insights is to make sure you consider all the angles we're going to walk through the unique perspectives within the API value chain. So when you look at the question, what makes a great API product, which is essentially what our insights want to try to answer, that question and the actual roles and the responsibilities that you can use to affect that may vary based off of where you sit in the value chain. So whether you're on the API team and you're the product manager, you may care more about meeting a business goal. Whereas if you're on the IT ops side, you're really focused on keeping those APIs up and running, right? And then that's a slightly different perspective than if you're sitting in the app developer part of that value chain, where you also have business and development concerns, but the types of actions that you can take to affect that, you're not going to actually go back and change something with the back-end design, right? It's actually going to affect your usage and your perceived notion of how reliable and stable that API is. So we can use this as a means to try to figure out, am I giving all the insights to figure out what is a great API?
Okay, and so Kumar, but do I have to start with that? Couldn't I just figure it out later? Couldn't I just get things deployed and then figure out what I need later?
Right. So the answer is, you should not. It's because the data is everywhere. Tons of it is being produced all the time, and you could have the best possible data set. If you don't know what you need to extract from it and what signals are important to your business, what signals will tell you if your users are happy or not, what signals will tell you if your developers are engaged or not, and are they happy with your APIs. So it's about, you collect the data, but when it comes to analytics and actually understanding what the data is telling you, you have to start with the questions.
Okay. All right. So now we're looking at some of the different roles that you were just addressing. So the product manager, the kind of questions they're going to have are around improving the product?
Yeah, I assume so. I mean, the product manager oversees an API product, and he needs to meet certain business goals at the end of the day. And while the goals may vary, right, from increased efficiency to sparking innovation or pure monetization, a common thread is that success hinges on making that API product easier for that consumer, that app developer, to use. So, for example, the questions that the product manager may have would be, does my API product make things easier for the consumer? Is it something that, who is my consumer? Essentially, who are the app developers who are using my API? Are they satisfied? What types of applications are they using my API for?
And I would extend the product manager to, there's an extension. You think about the business owner of the API strategy, and what are the questions they would ask? They'll ask questions like, is my API program growing, and how do you answer that? The way you answer that is, are my number of apps, number of developers, are they active? Are they just registered, not doing anything? Is my traffic going up? Is transactional traffic going up, which actually creates value for my business? The second question someone might ask in that role would be, are my developers, end users, partners engaged? Right? What's the success ratio of them entering my this API funnel, let's say, and coming out of it successful on the other end? That means they have a successful app with end users, or the end user is finding value in the product that's delivered through my API chain. Another question might be, is my business growing that is running on my APIs? Right? Do I have new markets being developed? Do I have new users, new kinds of users, relationship between my other channels and the API channel? And are they working together to offer a better experience to my end users? And all of this is, these are the kind of questions that are harder to answer. But if you think about design up front, it is easy, it's fairly easy to think about what needs to be instrumented so that you can collect the data and actually start answering these types of questions. But I think there's the product manager, there's the day-to-day tactical working of the API program, and then there's the, think about the quarterly review where the business owner says, is my investment leading to where I intended it to be.
Got it. But that upstream business level is going to be heavily impacted by what Teresa was talking about, which is the consumability of the API itself. So those two tie in. I think there's a direct one-to-one relationship there. And Teresa, if I'm understanding you correctly, because that consumability is such a key factor to the product manager, that's going to impact my design, my actual API.
That's right. So the insights that you want are things like, which APIs are popular, like Kumar said, but ultimately you want to figure out and extract why they are so, right? So to be able to have that insight early on enough that you can actually make a change.
So it impacts design itself.
That's right.
Well, now I'm starting to understand why you guys are saying start with the insights, because I can see when it has an impact on the design itself, obviously you have to start with that. It's not something you want to retrofit.
And so part of what we also want to do is to not, some of the things we're talking about when we say trends and volumes, it may sound like we're only talking about traditional fixed reporting. And again, I just want to emphasize this theme that that's just what has happened. We don't want it just to be a quarterly report, right? We want it to have a early and real-time enough insight that you can make that change before it's already become unsuccessful and the developer has already moved on to another product.
Right.
Agility is a big deal, right? And the way you can be agile with a purpose is by looking at data and looking at analytics and answering these questions repeatedly, so that maybe you need a new revision for your API, maybe you need a new version, and understanding if it's hitting the mark, if your value prop is being delivered to your developers or end users, and if not, then taking an action on it is critical.
Right, so for each of these perspectives, we try to identify a sort of type of API analytics that we think would drive additional insights for each of the roles. So that's kind of how the rest of this is structured, right, as we walk through the value chain. And so as I talked about the real-time insights for the product manager, things like the access pattern and the anti-pattern, I think would be valuable insights. So I define a pattern as an ordering of API calls. So for example, if I'm in an online retail store, their checkout process, there's a catalog, shopping cart, account, shipping, payment, order. There's a particular timing and pattern in which those may be called, right? And so you can use things like machine learning to automatically find these patterns, and ultimately that gives you some value in terms of the real-time insights. So one is you can just check, are people using that pattern correctly? And you may be able to reach out early enough to help if they are not. Or you may be able to identify patterns that may indicate, let's say, a case of data extraction. If I saw my catalog API being called in very quick succession without anything else, and maybe this happens at a regular interval, there's a good chance that there's a data extraction case happening. And so this gives the insight to the product manager to determine, is this an activity I want to disallow? Or maybe I identify an opportunity to monetize. And so really understanding, in this case, what is happening and why, using this pattern or possibly an anti-pattern as something you don't want to have happen, gives that product manager a holistic view of how my API is being used and ultimately will help improve my API product.
I completely agree. In fact, if you think about the kinds of patterns that you have to deal with it, what can happen is you might make an assumption about your users, and you figure out what's the right API design, and you release with it. It might turn out that people use it in unintended manner, which you didn't intend, but it's a good thing.
Yeah.
It leads to new opportunities. I mean, it could be things like maybe you designed your API to be used by automatic machines, but it turns out that the usage is coming from manual usage of the API. It could be there's a bunch of API requests that are repeat requests, right? They're accessing the same data. They're getting it back. Maybe that tells you that you need a caching layer, right? So looking at these patterns, how they're being used, is it manual versus automatic, repeat versus unique? What's the sequence of APIs if you have multiple APIs or resources within an API? What is the sequence in which they're used? And does that mean that you need to come up with a new version of an API, or if it means that you might need to make some changes in your proxy layer, things like pagination or caching or sorting? All of these things are you might not want to build them up front, but looking at your data in real time and real usage tells you what you might want to change and how you can add that in the back end at the proxy layer, or even on the app itself by working with the developers.
Okay, excellent. All right, now we move to ops.
Yeah, we're switching hats, right?
Okay.
So now we're focused on keeping the APIs running and meeting service level agreements. So clearly, from an ops perspective, you are still going to have real-term insights needed to troubleshoot performance and security issues, as well as longer-term insights needed for capacity planning that may ultimately affect things like pricing if there's a cost associated. So like with the product manager, I think operations folks can leverage that machine learning and that pattern to detect events that are undetectable by the human perspective by itself, right? And this is especially important for this ops role, I think, because there's a need for speed, right? In the ops role, they need to quickly identify issues, troubleshoot causes, and ultimately apply a fix, because that's going to impact their job of keeping those APIs running.
Sure. Well, and by the nature of the consumers of API, it's a very dynamic environment out there. You got a lot of different devices, a lot of different types of users, a lot of different partners. Things can go viral in a hurry. So the ability to get fast information and to be able to act on that information quickly seems very important.
That's where the human latency comes in, right? There's an alert, and now that alert has to possibly end up as a code fix deployed to production. And what's the, how long does it take to make the decisions to get to the, what is the fix, what is the version upgrade you need to do, and then actually doing it, and that requires the entire organization to work together.
Yeah.
And that's where designing for it and how you collect, consume, and act is important.
The context from the API layer is very important to help figure out why or what is happening, right? So if the call seems suspicious, then ultimately you may be able to apply a fix that is requesting re-authentication, is masking sensitive fields, or blocking access altogether, right? That's a different response than if you identified the why as a case of legitimate use. Then the choice may be whether or not to scale the backend services. So I scale the backend if it's for a paid user, as opposed to not scaling a backend if it's just a test system, right? So having that real-time insight becomes very important to be able to figure out, not just randomly connecting the automation in place so I scale without knowing why.
Okay.
I like to call it change analytics, just a term I use, but what it really means is what's happening right now, and how does it compare to what happened 10 seconds ago, or 1 minute ago, or 1 month ago? And how does it compare to what's happening during the evening time in a time zone, or the weekend, or the week? It's all about looking at what you can see right now and comparing it with different perspectives on time, and looking at what's changed. And if it's a change that you need to take an action on, you need to have an alert for it.
Okay. All right. Another role. So from the business side, the app developer.
Yeah, so now we're the consumer of the APIs. So from the API provider perspective, right, you need to consider the consumer, because ultimately that's who the success of your program is going to depend on. So from that app developer perspective, a business type implication would be that they need APIs that will ultimately keep their business up and running. And so their concerns about stability and reliability need to be addressed. And so they could probably get some ideas of what's happened in the past, looking at places like Programmable Web or Mashape that have repositories about what's popular, and they can kind of influence their decisions based off of that. But I think part of what we're talking about is some more real-time insights here.
And then so the pattern, anti-pattern with these guys?
Oh yeah, so I think the cool part would be the API supply chain. Ultimately, it's a supply chain where your app depends on the API, and ultimately depend on another API further upstream, right? So you, as a provider, you can differentiate your API by essentially helping assuage that developers' concerns about reliability. So having a provable SLA in terms of, I'm going to actually give you insight and access into what's my current state. Maybe it's just as much as if it's running or if it's degraded, right? This gives the downstream partner, that developer, more confidence in your abilities. Again, that provability. So with something like Amazon, when I use Amazon, they give me SLAs of 3 nines. But ultimately, that onus is on me as the consumer of Amazon to figure out if they're actually meeting that SLA or not. Wouldn't it be great if, as a provider, I would prove that to you, but I'm going to capture this, I'm going to give you the data feeds, possibly through an API, right? I'm going to give you that feed so that you can check it, and that's how confident I am in my abilities.
Right. I think when you think about coming back to choice, from a business perspective, the app developer is taking a dependency on your API, and if there are two time frames that you want to think about: before they take the dependency, and then after they've taken the dependency. Where they're making that decision, it's really about trust and reputation. Does the developer trust that this API will be there when their app is being used in the real world by real people, and it means something financial for the developer? Right. They will actually, this is their business. And so thinking about, can you help them make that decision by being transparent, by providing the right information up front? And then when you think about after they've made the dependency, it goes down to just like any consumer, it's customer retention. How do you make sure that they are continuously satisfied with the APIs, the level of the quality of service they're getting from the API, and ensuring that when things go wrong, they get they get the support, they get the data and the insights on whether what went wrong. Are they impacted? Is everyone impacted? Is a special type of apps impacted? All of this information is critical to maintaining that trust and having a good reputation. And like all consumers, developers also talk to each other, and it's very easy to lose trust. And that trust, that bad word of mouth, will travel if you don't think about it up front and how to handle it.
So it's kind of intuitively, it would seem like those kind of metrics are very operational. But you're saying counterintuitively, it's the app developers whose reputation is on the line, whose business is on the line, and so those seemingly very operational metrics are the kind of metrics that the app developer needs.
Right. To continuously to decide to go with you and then also stick with you.
Okay, that's very interesting. On the development side, obviously there's just getting the app built.
Just as you're debugging and coding against it, what sort of support can I expect?
Okay.
And this is where thinking about the developer lifecycle is very important. Developers come to your site thinking that they will start using your API. They will sign up. They will check out your APIs. They'll do some test calls. At some point, they'll decide, yes, this is the API I want to go with, and then they will start creating your app. And then the app will make calls to your system, and then eventually the app will go into production or an app store. Real people will download it and start using it. And thinking about, as an API provider, your goals should be to look at data that tells you, how many developers are able to go through that funnel and end at the successful state, which is an app has been released in the real world and it's actually, whatever the success metric is, maybe it's money, maybe it's traffic, but it's successful. And at the same time, ensuring that it happens really fast. Right? We want developers to enter the funnel and come out on the other end as fast as possible with the highest success ratio. That's why I call it it's activation. Right? What's the activation rate? What is the success rate? And all of that, these are metrics that API provider from the perspective of the app developer are critical for ensuring your developer program is healthy. And it doesn't have to be an external facing API program. It applies internally also, as Brian said in the beginning. Maybe internally, even if you have an API program, your app team might lose trust in your APIs and they might do things differently. And that you have to answer that question to someone, that why would within the same organization somebody not trust an internal API program versus something else?
Okay, excellent. All right, and then the pattern on these guys.
Right, so I think, again, one way you can differentiate is ultimately making their jobs easier. And one thing that, developers do a lot of times that is probably not such a pleasant part is troubleshooting and essentially tracing where a problem occurred. And this is especially unpleasant if you don't know if it's your code or if it's something that's happening from the API upstream, right? So as much visibility into this as possible. So ultimately it'd be nice. I mean, I know Apogee has a bunch of products around the mobile analytics space as well as within the actual gateway product to be able to trace this, right? To trace from when the API is made on the end user device through the app across the mobile network to the gateway and ultimately in the backend systems, figuring out where something went wrong and having that visibility. So this is something that's collaborative between the provider and the consumer, right? The app developer had to write in their app, right, the ability to collect the logs, to collect latency and delay metrics and faults, and then from the provider side to actually provide that visibility to help that app developer, right? So it's a collaborative type insight.
Tracking these interactions with developers when things go wrong is again, it's good. It's not completely analytics, but if you think about it as scientifically, you can say that maybe you can improve based on what you're seeing with what your developers are facing. You can change what error responses and details your API returns. Maybe that, once you see that developers are not able to troubleshoot and troubleshoot their problems, how do you improve the API experience and the API design so that it returns information that speeds that up? So just kind of meticulously looking at what is interaction like, are developers getting the information they need or not, and building tools and making changes in your design might be, it's a good way of making the app developer successful. And at the end, that's exactly what you want.
Excellent. All right, so we've talked about the first of the 1-2 punch, which is what are the questions that I need to ask if I'm in one of these different roles. And now, obviously, once I've got those questions, I'm going to want answers to those questions, right? So let's talk about that a little bit.
So we identified a couple, just through talking. We talked about availability and performance, volumes and trends. Moving beyond that, things like conversation traces, the trace route, the call pattern, and the anti-pattern. So these are some common insights. And to get those insights, you need to have instrumentation, right? And so common instrumentation, we already talked about Apogee Mobile Analytics, within the Apogee Gateway, the Apogee Insights, working also with the back end, right? Because if you just stop with the Apogee products, you can't actually see how the API call may impact your back-end systems, how many CPUs, how much memory, how much storage is being run up, right? So ultimately, you need to think about it as a overall API value chain and where the API vantage point is.
Yeah, and it's about thinking that the app is not the app that's running on the the device. It's everything that the app uses. It's the local the device APIs. It could be the mobile backend as a service. It will be the gateways that it goes through. It could be public APIs you're using, and it is the backend system. It's about looking at collecting data from all of them, because obviously it's all context that helps you answer the question that you have. But it's also important to be able to look at request that is that's usually a user doing something on an app, and how that goes through these various layers of your app and hits the backend, comes back, and how all of that happens with multiple backends, right? Because you'll be using multiple APIs that you are running, or public APIs that are used in your in the apps. It's about being able to string that data set together from these different sources and then answer those questions.
Yeah, I want to connect to something Kumar said earlier, right? It's around starting with the business insights and the goals of your API program. So earlier he talked about the difference between, let's say, an internal efficiency case, where then if I'm trying to promote internal efficiency, then monitoring points within my software development lifecycle, that becomes very important, as opposed to if I'm looking at an open API where I'm trying to target third-party app developers, then monitoring public code repositories like GitHub and Stack Overflow, right, become very important to figure out who your consumer is and how they're working with your API and if they're struggling or not. So the point is about figuring out what the success metrics are, and then working backwards to figure out how do you measure it and where do I get that data.
I got it. And it's definitely not one size fits all. You have to have some idea of what segment you're going after, who your consumers are, or you're not going to get it right. All right, so this says Accenture on it, so Teresa.
Yeah, no, so, when we think about, a lot of folks say, oh, we have APIs, right? And then there's really a difference between maturity levels in terms of having APIs and having a successful API program. And so we introduced this API maturity model as a means to try to explore and enable conversations around that maturity. So if we look at this through this analytics lens, let's talk about the maturity level a little bit, right? So we have some phases where phase 0 starts with ad hoc. And in ad hoc cases where API development and use is siloed within parts of the organization. And in this case, your API analytics may have no standards. You may have none, right? Except possibly what the vendor tool came with, and you might not even have turned that on. Next would be organized. And organized is around having a API strategy and business case driven use case, right? So you know what the goal is ahead of time. You're organized to do that. And here you can, once you've identified the goal, there's no reason not to have standard metrics and measures identified. So whether you've instrumented them or not, I think the first step is figuring out what those questions are. Then we have tactical. So tactical was building in the, where you're actually building the first systems that have all the automation and things in place. And in this case, the end-to-end instrumentation becomes really important to supply that right data that you needed to answer, am I successful and how do I ensure success? Then we talked about, we go to mission critical, step 3, where now once mission critical systems are supported by this environment, you really need that insight to automation, action-driven automation to help support your SLAs. Otherwise, with the API use case, right, part of the reason why you go is that you can uncover new use cases that you didn't anticipate before. Right. So if it's something mission critical, you better have that capability there. And then finally, our industrial phase, where industrial, we're assuming that in the future, next 3 to 5 years, API become that de facto model where all business and connections go through. And so moving beyond the what happened to the what is happening and why, and leveraging machine learning and artificial intelligence to essentially predict what's going to happen so you can act on it much earlier on in the game.
So we can have Kumar's cyborgs, and we'll just get rid of the human latency altogether.
I think that's what
right.
we're saying. Phase 5 will be.
So actually, that's very true. In fact, we were joking about it, but what's going to happen is when we're in this stage 4 and APIs are everywhere, and they're matured enough, and businesses are now relying on APIs that already are, but increasing number of businesses are relying on these as their primary channel of how things happen. What's going to happen is the data is collected. What you end up with is that every component of your value chain, from servers to network switches to APIs and apps, backends, everything's going to have a profile, right? It's how does that system, that component, act normally, and then how does it act when things are wrong. When your data starts creating models for these profiles, for behavior profiles for these components, now you're in a state where you can detect change and deviation from these profiles, and you actually take an action. And that is where operational efficiency and business intelligence come together to say things like, let's say my business intelligence tells me that users, I've been able to segment my users into high value and low value users. Or I've been able to segment my traffic into high value traffic, and maybe it's abusive traffic that I don't want to service. You can use that business intelligence now in your API layer to now actually make operational changes by saying my high value traffic or users go to my better hardware, and my bad traffic goes to the worse hardware. Similarly, you can now go the other way. You can say my operational intelligence tells me that a part of my network chain is down or it's acting slower than normal. I can ensure that the traffic that is going to lead to revenue or whatever success metric I have actually does not go there. I can automatically spin up other versions of my other endpoints and actually route that traffic automatically and remove that human latency from that. It's actually where we need to be, and it's not rocket science and it's not science fiction because it's being done in other places. I think it's time to think about that seriously in the world of APIs also.
Sure, having predictive, trending, preemptive changes happening, both at the operational level and just at the functionality level, would obviously have upstream impact to the business.
Exactly.
That makes sense. So, but in the same breath, you've managed to both describe an efficiency that we should be doing and pander to our cyborg overlords.
Okay.
So good for you.
I'm not going to escape that now, so it's okay.
All right. So we're saying we've looked at the value chain earlier. We looked at the different kind of roles. We talked about the how we need to start with the questions. So this is kind of tying it together, right?
It is, and ultimately what we want to enable at the end of the day is the conversation with the data, right? So to be able to ask the questions, am I successful? Why not? What should I do better? Right? You need to have the questions and the data to be able to make those decisions, and so that's why we call it a conversation with data. And I guess one thing that I wanted to mention around the maturity model, right? A lot of folks who are just getting started with APIs, they may have one set of APIs, one app. Sometimes they wonder, well, I don't need to be thinking about analytics. I have all these other things that I'm doing, and analytics is not for me. And you won't be able to have that conversation with the data to be able to evolve the program if you don't build for that in place.
That's a good point. Yeah, and this is not a hypothetical. I've actually spoken a lot. Part of my job, I get to fly around the world, talk to a lot of customers about what they're doing, where they are with APIs. So I get a good sense of their maturity. And I'll tell you, most folks, and this is Fortune 1000, Global 2000 companies, most folks are at zero right now. They're dabbling, would be the best way to describe it. Maybe they've got 1 or 2 mobile apps ad hoc built. Most of the customers that we deal with are going into the 1 and 2. And we've discussed this before, that because of the agility challenges at large organizations, you probably want to think of 1 and 2, even though they happen chronologically, serially, you probably want to think of them as one gestalt entity and just hit them both at the same time. If you find the right tools and the right design, it'll probably happen anyway. I don't know that I've ever seen anyone of all the companies I've dealt with that's all the way to your cyborg level. That would be a great aspiration to get to, but I don't know that I've seen someone who's at that level yet.
That's probably true, and it's one of those things, right? It's once you have the API product out there, then you start thinking about improving it, and that's where you start thinking about using analytics to actually ask the right questions to address the improvements that are needed, and that's where these things will become more and more important.
So Kumar, in your hat at Apogee, is the cyborg human coming as the next Apogee analytics product?
Well, we're always thinking about that.
When we were talking about which questions to ask, and the question was around, should I just expose all of my APIs right away and then see what kind of traction I get off those APIs? Because that kind of rides the line of what I was asking earlier. Well, can't I just kind of throw things out there and then figure it out, like just based on usage,
Right.
where my traction is?
I think sometimes for innovation type cases where you have some APIs where you think this data might be valuable, maybe it's a retail based location where I have different, I want a list of all my stores, the services they offer, the times that they have, and I just want to throw it out there to see how it works. That's still a goal, right? You go into that, releasing that data with a goal in mind that I think this will be useful for somebody. And so using that as the goal, figure out how do I measure success. So Kumar mentioned some things earlier around the API keys, ultimately using some of the API patterns that we talked about to reverse engineer to see how they're being used. Finally, to actually figure out whose those big volumes are, and then going to those apps to see what is it being used for, right? So there's a goal in mind even with that open innovation use case. And then there should be a time when I think, oh, how long do I want to wait? Do I wait a month, 6 months, a year? Figure out how long that is to be able to figure out when am I successful. And maybe it's not enough. So maybe you release that location-based service and it's not getting the pickup you thought. Maybe it's because you're not giving enough other richness of data to be able to do that, or the format's not correct, right? You use some ID that is just internal to your organization that nobody else knows about.
Right.
So without that insight, you won't be able to make the change early enough.
At the same time, I would caution against just throwing everything out there because, right, we're talking about action, right? And you have limited resources, you have a limited number of people actually being able to process the data. So you want to minimize distractions. So it's always good to start again, with what's the business goal? Which API represents the core of your business? Get that out there. Maybe there are a couple of other ones that you want to test and experiment. But as Teresa said, there's the business part and there's innovation, and there are different streams. But ensuring that you have the bandwidth to collect the data, right, ask the right questions, and then act on it is critical. Otherwise, you'll be just ended up with is just fragmenting the attention that you have and your resources, and you would make less progress versus if you would just concentrate on the biggest things that you need to fix.
Okay, great. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. It's always such a pleasure to do these broadcasts with you. Love talking about APIs, love talking about data and analytics that come along with APIs. I want to thank Kumar and Teresa for joining me today. Any last thoughts?
I think we should not think about analytics as just performance and what's the response time, what's the error rate. Those are extremely critical for operating your APIs, but thinking about your consumers, end users or developers or partners, and how successful are they in interacting with your interfaces, which might not just be the API, it might be the developer portal, it might be your support forum, and actually using data there also to ensure that they're serviced well, they are supported when they need to, and they understand what's going on and where you're going. All of that is important data and analytics also, in addition to all the performance and operational metrics. So
okay.
I would say, ensure that there's a balance in how you use data and address all the requirements for a good API product.
All right, folks, thank you so much. Have a great day, and we will see you on our next broadcast. Thank you.
Thank you.